But now we're going to move on. One important aspect of developing mission information work is always the funding of it. And those of us who work here always need our daily bread. This was one of the topics at our 2016 meeting in Dallas. And our next speaker, John Hurst, has done a lot of thinking about it. John is Chief Innovation Officer at SIL. John, over to you.
All right. Thank you all. It's good to be with you. I want you to reach into your wallets, if you have your wallets, your purses, or your bags, and pull out a dollar bill or your currency. Pull out something that is your local currency. So go ahead and pull something out real quick. If you got a coin, it's fine. Anything you have. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get set up while we do that. So give me 1 second. All right. Okay. So I want you to wave it up. Show me the money, as they would say in America. Show me what your bill looks like. Oh, Chris doesn't have any, just fingers. There you go. Anyone have anything to show? Different currencies. I see Peter. Laura's got a dollar bill there. We've got some euros, I see. All right. There's a coin there. All right. Think for a moment with me about how you tend to feel about money when it comes to your work. You know, it's gonna bring up an emotion in you, right? We tend to have a lot of emotions about resources when it comes to our work, and those emotions are very different. Sometimes we feel stretched by them, right? We struggle to know where they're going to come from. Other times we feel it's more of a management decision. How do we manage these resources well, right? Sometimes it's a matter of resources are in one part of our organization or our movement, but maybe not another part. And so how do we allocate them in a way that would allow us each to do our work? Whatever it is that you may be feeling, I want you to, as we go through this discussion about funding models, I want you to ask God to make that present to you. You know, one of the things I find so much when we talk about money is that we tend to not want to talk about it. We tend to kind of push it down. And then our emotions about money just pop up in different places. The same emotions pop up, but just in different ways. And so ask God to show you what you're feeling about the resources you have or do not have, the money you wish you had, the resources you need to do the mission information work you're doing. And as we talk about these models today, I want you to be praying about, God, what do you want me to be learning or thinking about related to those models? Right. So first of all, I'd like to talk about what is a funding model. Well, very simply, it's a repeatable way to get the funds you need for your work. It's not anything fancier than that. And we all have a funding model we're working under. It doesn't matter how you're doing your work. There's a way that you are receiving resources. In the end, God is providing those. And there is a way that you're then using those resources to produce your work. And it come to find out, there's actually a lot of different models that are available to us. But many, many times we don't fully understand what they are. We don't appreciate how to work with them. And we also struggle to know their place in our work. Because for many, many years, that kind of secular sacred divide caused us to see money as a problem, as something that would contaminate our work. And so we've struggled to wrestle through all those things throughout the history of mission. But I'd like to talk for a moment about why mission information funding is so hard, particularly, right? Why do we struggle more than maybe some other parts of mission work? Well, number one, we're way behind the front lines in many ways, right? The work that we're doing is not feeding those who need food, planting the church, healing the sick. We are doing something that is much further back from that, no less important, but it's far from the front lines in many ways. It's also not always understood. That contribution isn't always understood, and it's not always very valued by different people. So we wrestle with trying to explain what we do, right? And also helping people either who have the money to give or to pay for something, or the people that are in leadership over us to see the value of what we're doing. Also, I'm sure you've noticed that could be a lot of agendas around information. People who have assumptions, right, around what is true and what isn't, and what they hope the research will and will not show. And so we have to wrestle with those assumptions and those agendas. Also, another reality in mission information resourcing is that many times the mission information is used for mobilization, and other times it can be used as a strategic tool for decision making. Those two things are funded differently, and it causes even more confusion in how people think about funding our work. So these are some challenges that we face. I think the other thing that we have to realize is the who has changed in global mission over the last 100 years, and the what has changed. So just scroll through this Zoom meeting, and you'll see that mission information is now much more inclusive and representative of the global church than it was, let's say, 100 years ago. So who is involved, and the funding models under which they work has changed dramatically. Also, the what has changed. Mission information has become much more professionalized, sophisticated. Many more technological tools and resources are now at work, which means that the money that it takes to do some of this work has also increased. We also have to consider that who the information is for is sometimes not very clear. As practitioners, many of you are collecting, analyzing, and applying mission information for leaders, for people in movements that are trying to guide those movements. Many times, though, there's also funders of research who have other needs for that information. Mission researchers balancing both things, always trying to figure out how to figure out the needs that the funders have for the research, the leaders have for the research, and the practitioners have. So bottom line, the problem, funding for mission information is difficult. There are different audiences who are driven by competing expectations. And we, in many cases, are tasked with dealing with all of that, working through all of that. So I'd like to frame up for you 3 postures as you then approach those challenges. So I've seen many people, when they come to funding models in ministry, they take an ideological posture. My way is the right way. My funding model is the right funding model. And many of you either can recognize that in yourselves or have recognized that in other people. The next one is pragmatic. Whatever way works, meaning that if this way works in this instance, I'll do it. If this way works in this other instance, I'll do it. Whatever it takes to get the money I need to do the work. We've all experienced that model, that posture as well. The final one, which is slightly different than pragmatic, is what I call practical. And it is saying that I want to align the way I use with the values I have. So pragmatic ends up being that the ends justify the means, right? I'll do whatever it takes to get the money I need. We know that tends to take us to places that compromise some of our values. Mm-hmm. And that's why I really, when I'm talking about funding models, I like to challenge people not to land in an ideological posture or a pragmatic posture, but consider a practical posture. One that allows you to be contextualized, yet values driven as you work with money and funding. We all have assumptions about funding models, right? Funding models, many people think they're designed to oppress the powerless, right? We see that over and over again, and we've experienced that. We say funding ends up getting more to the wealthy and less to those who need it. We sometimes can think that funding models are good or bad. There's good ones and bad ones, or that they're just a necessary evil. It's something I have to put up with, but not anything that's very helpful. We also can think that maybe they're not really all that compatible with each other. Well, I'd like to push back on some of those assumptions. So read these statements real quick. I won't read them each to you. But I think that there's some ways to think about funding models that might be helpful to you in shaping your strategy and missions information. So how many on the call have heard of what's called open access? Show of hands, anyone? Well, what open access means is it's a group of funding models. And I define it very quickly. It's everyone can come, see, and take. And the way that open access models work, feel free to go look at it on Wikipedia. There's a very in-depth article. There's multiple layers of open access. It's as complicated as you want to make it. But bottom line, in open access funding models, the money comes in at the front. So the money is front loaded into your mission information work. So let me just give you 3 examples. Think about patronage, right? A wealthy person who is a patron of the arts, who commissions a public sculpture to be enjoyed by everyone. We could say in many ways that the missionary funding model is very similar to a patronage model in the sense that you have donors who preload money into our support and then allow us to go out and do good work, right? So there's some similarities there. There's also some ways it's not like that, but you could talk about it in that way. Then you have self-funding, right? You have people who preload themselves with resources, meaning they retire early and they don't require a salary, and they're able to do their work at no expense to anyone else. And then we have probably the most common today in the open access world, which is institutional open access. And that is where the Gates Foundation or the EU or the government of Thailand or whatever will essentially fund mission or research. In this case, they're not doing mission information at that level, but they fund research and say, one of our prerequisites is that you make it free because we want everyone to have access to this, right? So they do that. So with open access funding models, there's what I call the magic and the trap, right? So the magic is that in many ways, it's infinitely scalable. If it's free to the end user, as many end users that want to use it can access it. The challenge with open access is the money had to come from somewhere. Sometimes that money is fairly murky, and sometimes it's less dependable than we would think. Governments change from one year to the next, and maybe their research funding changes. As people who have raised support, many times we have made decisions on the field about what our donors would want to hear about. But that's invisible to our end users. They don't know why we're making some of those decisions. Now, obviously, we try not to do that, but it's a factor. So where the money comes from is not always very clear, but it ends up having an impact on the end result. I'd like to talk to you about another set of funding models that I call sustainable solutions. And they're different because they're backloaded, right? So we have the front-loaded funding models where the money comes in first and then you do your work and it mostly is free on the other end. With back-loaded models, you do the work, but then you recoup the money through different funding models that would be more like paid services, products and sales, etc. And I described this as lasting responses to problems. So a few examples are a donor-funded project where it's project-related, where they looked at your work before, they said, we like your work, we're going to give you money for more work. So it's a little bit merit-based, but it's still donor money. You got product sales. Think about selling the Operation World book, right? That book was sold, that money was then turned into work on the next edition of Operation World. Professional services, many of you have charged some money to someone in the ministry world to do a little bit of research. And data licensing is probably not as common, but there are data sets that we have that are actually valuable to be put into other people's solutions that can be utilized. And finally, advertising, where someone puts an advert next to the content, the missions research. We don't see this a lot. We see it a little bit like, let's say maybe in some of our publications, right, magazines, but also in conferences, right? If you have a sponsor of your talk, and then you're able to share what you say, but there's a sponsor that enables that to happen. Now, when I talk about these models, I talk about the reward and the blind spot. The reward is that when you create something and you're rewarded for that creation when the users value it and pay you for it, right? So there's immediate confirmation that what you produced has value to specific people. And it allows it to be a little more self-sustaining in the sense that as long as you're providing value to those people and they're paying you for it, you can then produce more mission information. The blind spot is that you tend to focus on the users that pay you the most. And so users, many times that have financial barriers, don't get heard as easily. So it can be harder to hear from those people. What I would like to propose to you, and then I'll wrap up and Chris, come back to you if you want to do any questions, is I'd like to propose to you that what we need is not preloaded or backloaded funding models only. We need what I would call a funding model toolbox. That's to look at our ministry, our program of research, and say, what are all the funding models we might use to best sustain the work that God has for us to do? So the solution I'd like to propose for you to consider is that you diversify your funding strategies that take into account the difficulty, the unique audiences, and the diverse expectations inherent in mission information. So you might have both, you might provide some professional services. You might have missionary support where you can give away some things because there's no requirement that you make that money back in the same way. You might produce a product that you sell. All these things together can make up a viable funding strategy for your mission information work. So back to you, Chris.
Okay, thanks. We have a little time probably, so if anyone wants to ask a question or make a comment on anything that John has said, please raise your hand now. Or I see some people have, right. Daniel Hoskins. Daniel.
John, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask the question, at one point, I wasn't completely clear, was some of what you're talking about was referring to what we would sometimes call a bivocational model, where someone is I didn't catch that clearly, so that's what I was looking for some clarification on. Thank you.
No, that's all. Yeah, thank you. I would say bivocational is one funding strategy for staffing. Absolutely. That would be. It's a good question. Would it kind of fit into that front loaded or back loaded? If it may be a mix, I would say more front loaded because you're essentially you have a job. And that job is releasing you through resources to spend some of your time then on ministry. And sometimes it's very integrated, right? Some of those things are like, they're both all together, mixed together, and it's a highly integrated, where the ministry and the job are very much all part and parcel with the same. So I would say that's more on the front loaded side as far as the funding model, but another great example. Yeah.
Okay. Ray?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for the presentation. I'm with a famous organization that doesn't believe in appealing for funds. So I think it just, in this day and age, it's just hard to think that God also somehow just called those little circle of people around you to support that work. So yeah, I just appreciate different perspectives.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Some appreciative comments in the chat, John. Morris Johnson.
Hi, John. Yeah, thanks so much for that. That was very helpful. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more, maybe you touched on it, maybe you didn't, about intellectual property, the concept in this space, and how you think about that, and help us think about when it, sort of claiming an intellectual property right to some information, how that works, when that works, and when it's problematic.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that could be a whole session all on its own. And this group needs to wrestle with that. What I would say is that just like this, right? Just like my hand representing me, just IP, intellectual property, is another resource, and we can choose to do with that resource what God asks us to do, right? But it is still ours to steward. So not stewarding it isn't an option. But as we steward it, we have to ask God. Again, I go back to that practical posture. God, what is the opportunity in front of me, and what are the values that you've given me to walk by, and what should I do in the moment based on that? I would say in some instances, it's very appropriate to take that IP and what we would call monetize it, essentially make it a part of your funding model. In other instances, it's very appropriate to say that is actually going to be free information, right? It's going to be open access, right? We're not going to charge for that information. And there could be times when in one form it's free, in another form it is charged for, right? There's a million ways you can dissect it. What I'd like to challenge you with, because our time is very short, is just don't think about it as there's only one way to use intellectual property. I'd challenge you to be a little more thoughtful in what are the ways it needs to be used to accomplish my mission based on what God's asked me to do, given the resource that it is. So just be real thoughtful about it, and be open to the fact that there may be multiple ways that IP can be utilized.
We've time for one more question. I'll take it from Stephanie Kraft.
Jon, could you speak into the issue of research as overhead versus research as ministry?
Yeah. I think we're getting to the end of the stage. So donors for many years have focused on what your overhead is, trying to keep that overhead as low as possible. And so when you thought about missions information that had to do with overhead, it was very hard to get it funded, right? With general fund money. We're coming more to the end of that stage in the life cycle of donors, in the sense that donors are understanding more and more that there's all these other things that have to be done to make field ministry effective, and research is one of them. I would say this issue is not as prominent as it used to be. But what I would say is that as you're designing your revenue strategy and your research strategy, there's certain research that is really clearly overhead, meaning it's research that is really about making the organization better. Classify that in overhead. But there's a whole bunch of research that is not overhead, even though it's not on the ground, planting churches, training up people, but it can be built into your ministry budgets. And I would encourage you, if your leaders aren't willing to do that, I would encourage you really to challenge them on that and say, if the research is helping us to do better ministry on the ground, we can build that into our field budget and not into the overhead budget, and make it easier to raise money for as we pursue those funds.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you very much, John. I think that we'll end it there. We're coming to the conclusion on the first day of our conference, thinking about developing our work.